All right. Welcome back, everyone. Today is Friday, November 19th, and this is the pupil weighting, the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report, whatever we're called. Thanks for joining us again. And we are going to pick up where we left off, but shift to our next witness, which is Deb Brighton from the Joint Fiscal Office, who's joining us online. So Deb, why don't you just introduce yourself and then take it away with what you would like us to look at.
Okay, thank you. I'm Deb Brighton, consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. And I'm sort of going to follow up with Brad's presentation this morning and talk about where the two systems kind of split apart, the current law and the cost equity approach. So I wanted to start with going back to putting dollars next to the weights. And that is the table that's cost associated with pupil weights. Everybody find that?
The very bottom one.
We have it.
Oh, okay. And I wanted to start there for three reasons. One is because I think it helps people look at the different weights and assume and figure out, consider whether each one is reasonable or not. And the second is because I think it's also helpful to look at the total of education spending that would be associated with each weight, that would sort of be allocated in that direction, and what's left over for your sort of basic student education. And the third reason is because it's a starting point for the cost equity approach to it. And so what it's showing you is basically each of the categories that Brad went through with the weights that he went through. But then next to it is, rather than turning it into long-term weighted ADMs, to look at what the cost is that would be associated with each student. So in other words, each middle school student, we know it's a weight of 0.36. That would mean it's equal to 0.36 of a long-term weighted ADM. But in terms of cost, we're saying it's a cost of $3,620. Okay, and if you go through that for every single category, they would all be the same process. You just multiply the number of, and I think Brad called it enrolled cohort. But basically, as you discussed earlier, it's not entire students in the district. The middle school weight only applies to middle school students, and the sparsity weights would apply to, say, all the people in the district. It depends on your different cohort for each of the weights. So let's see, the fourth column here is the number of eligible students in the state. That was just summing up Brad's columns for each weight. And then the next column, the cost, it's $1 million cost for each of the weights. So for example, for middle school students, we're allocating $66.9 million as sort of the excess spending related to middle school students in the state. And that is 4.7% of the total education spending.
Deb, I'm sorry, just a second. Representative Kornheiser has a question.
You said excess spending. You didn't mean that sort of in a technical way, right? Like spending. Yes.
Right, not excess spending, but all of these students count as a student. And then middle school students we're expecting are going to cost you $3,620 more. Okay, so it's not the total cost of the student, it's the additional amount of that student. Okay, it's the value of the weight.
And Deb, are you going to go over how you came to these numbers? The cost per eligible student?
Right. I'm not going to exactly take you through the math necessarily, but I'll tell you this is derived from the weights, and it is the average amount that you would be attributing to each of these so that you actually come up with this amount if you ran it through current law. Okay, and I'll get into it a little bit more when we go through the process. But so what the cost per $1 million is telling you is, like, if you ran it through our current system, the weights that Brad gave you this morning, ran it through our current system, this is how much you would be spending on each of those students. Okay, the excess amount. Maybe I shouldn't say excess because it sounds like excess spending penalty, but it is sort of the extra cost above the base for those students. And then when you total it all up.
Just 1 second, we have a question of
Just
Senator Hooker.
it costs this much more to educate middle school students. So you've got the base amount and then this much more to educate. And that's what these numbers are, is that cost beyond the base.
Right, it's the extra amount. So essentially you do have a base amount, and the math behind it is this. You take our total education spending, and then you went through Brad's calculation, you end up with a total number of long-term weighted ADMs. And so you just divide that into the total education spending, and that tells you how much you should be spending on the base student, the average student. Okay, so then you just separate out the long-term weighted ADMs into which are the new guys and which are the original guys, and you can figure out what the base amount is.
Wait, I want to stop 1 second because this is based on what school districts have budgeted and what school districts are currently spending on students. It's not based on some magical number that we have determined is the right amount to spend on each of these categories. And I think that's really important to note, that these are based on school district locally determined budgets, and every school district is making their own independent decisions. Deb is just using those numbers to back into the cost per eligible student. She's not saying this is necessarily the right amount to be spending on each of these categories. She's saying that backing into the cost based on the weights provided in the study. Is that correct, Deb?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted, so it has no connection to the UVM study then?
It does have a connection
does.
to the UVM study in that these numbers were backed into using their weights, using the weights that they gave to us in the, what is it, October, whatever memo, 28th memo, 18th, the 28th, the October 28th memo. So those weights, the 1.3 for poverty, et cetera. As you can see in the blue column, those are the weights that they gave us.
Right.
So she's backing into the cost for those weights based on what school districts were spending in FY20.
And Deb, you're going to explain that a little bit more a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted.
Yes, and
On that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Representative or James, did you have?
Sounds like we're going to talk about it later.
Okay, all right, go ahead, Deb.
Okay, so the second part of this table, oh, well, actually, I should just point out that this table is based on having the ELL weight at 2.49. And then the column to the far right is just comparing that same cost per eligible student, going back to the ELL version that we were using before with ELL as a categorical grant. Okay, just so you can see the differences. But I'm going to continue with this comparison using the 2.49 category weighting for ELL, just so that we can compare with what you were doing this morning. But there are also tables to help you go back to the other ELL version if you want to. We're sort of worried about doing everything twice and having way too many printouts for you to go back and forth between. But anyway, what I'm really concerned about here is more the concept rather than which ELL way you want to go. So then on the bottom of the, I'm not sure how it shows up there, but anyway, there are some pie charts. And this is basically just showing you that the way the two models fit together and the way the weighting model turns into the costs. And that is that if you look at the number of long-term weighted ADMs that you add by the weights as a total, as a percentage of the total, you find out that they're 38%. So in other words, when you look at the total long-term weighted ADMs, the new ones that you've created through the weights are 38% of the total. And so that translates into the amount of money by saying exactly 38% of the education spending would be allocated to these newly created students that are created by the weights. All right, so I think that in terms of just being able to look at whether the weights seem reasonable or not, I think that by translating them into dollars and percentages of the education spending, you can see not only how they, the relative importance of each one, whether some are too high or too little, both by the dollar amount, but also by the percentage of our education spending that's going to that particular category of student. So now to get into where the two ways of delivering this, the money diverge, it is really, as Brad pointed out, they both go through essentially the same calculations that he took you through of each category times, in his case, the weight to get to weighted pupils. You could do the same thing by multiplying the eligible cohort in each category by this cost. And then, so each district would do that. At the end of the line, instead of adding up long-term weighted ADMs, you'd add up the cost. That would be the cost that you would need in your district to deal with these specific categories. And it's the excess cost in addition to the average base amount per pupil. It would be exactly the same thing if you went through Brad's model, ended up calculating the new long-term weighted ADM, and you multiplied by the base cost, which is around $10,000 per pupil. Either way, you get the same thing. So the reason that I'm bringing this up as to how similar they are is basically to point out that we can do this using exactly the same process as the weights without bothering to go through the pupil calculation, changing long-term weighted pupils and then turning it into equalized pupils. It's using the wisdom, the statistical results from the UVM study in the same way to calculate that first step, all the way through of, how much to allocate to each district. And then at that point, they sort of diverge. And the cost equity model doesn't go into equalized pupils. It stays right there. It takes that money that you've calculated that each district needs to deal with these costs, and it sends it directly to the district. And so I think that that the best way to look at the differences between the different models is to consider there are two pieces. One is cost equity, and the second is tax equity. And so I think what we're saying here is that the first part is dealing with the cost equity. And this is a piece that we didn't deal with well in Act 60. The second piece is the tax equity. And that is the piece that we did deal with well in Act 16. And so for that reason, I think it's helpful to sort of separate them. So there is a handout, and I think it's called Cost Equity Model English Language Learners.
That is what it's called, yes. It's the first
Okay.
one. Scott? Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, Scott, I'm sorry, Representative Beck.
I'd just like to ask a question before you move on. And I would like to welcome Representative Webb for being in the audience too. Just to. On Deb, on the last pie graph, you said you have in the blue, it says raise through HS rate. What is HS?
Oh, okay, that's the, all right. That is the second part. So in other words, what that is after the cost equity payment, the remainder is what has to be raised by using the homestead tax rate. Okay, so I think you can think of it as the cost equity payment, the cost equity piece is around, it varies on how you do this, but it's like 36 to 38%, depending on which weights you choose. Okay, and then the remainder, 62 to 64%, is what shifts into the tax calculation to figure out what your tax rate would be.
Okay, because I mean, we only raise about 480 million right now on the homestead taxpayers. So they would receive some help from the non-residential and the consumption also. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, got it.
I mean, I think people think that when they pay their homestead tax rate, they've raised their education spending, and that's not true. All it is it's your access to the equal resources in the education fund, and they come from all different sources. Okay. So if you pulled up that document, I think the first part.
Wait a second, it's called the Cost Equity Model English Language Learners. It's the very
Yes.
first with Deb Brighton's name on it. Okay. We got it. Representative Conlon, do you have a question or was that okay? You good? All right, go ahead, Deb.
Okay, so I'm thinking the first page starts with cost equity approach ELL as a categorical grant, but I'm thinking we maybe want to go to the English language learners as a weight. It's really your choice, but since Brad was working off of that one, maybe we should go down.
Is that page 3, Deb?
I guess it is. It starts with Addison Central again.
Yeah, so page 3.
Oh,
Where
no,
it-
actually, I'm sorry. No, that's a different one. Okay, we're going to have to start with, go back up to page 1. I'm sorry. So this is going to show you ELL as a categorical grant rather than as weighted at 2.49. But it's actually the approach that I want to be really clear about. Okay, so in this case, the cost equity calculation will only represent 38% of the total ed fund. I'm sorry, 36%, because it's a slightly lower amount. And so this is really starting after Brad's sheet at column 3. All right, and I just put that in there because not that you have to run through the weighted ADM calculation, but just to point out that we're parallel at this point. But instead of multiplying the weights by a student, we would have multiplied the eligible student cohort by the cost. and we come up with column 4, which is the cost equity payment. Okay. And we would add to this the ELL grant. And that would go directly from the ed fund to each district, without doing anything to the equalized students. Okay. Then there's sort of a gap in there. And then the columns to the right are sort of the tax calculation. So it starts out with the original FY20 spending. And I should note again that in all of these, in order to be able to compare apples to apples, we're using FY20 spending and FY20 rates. And as Senator Hardy pointed out, it's not to say that this is the right spending, but it just enables us to use real numbers to compare. So you would take your original FY20 spending, and then you would subtract what you got directly from the ed fund. And that would be a combination of your cost equity payment. I'm calling this CE for cost equity, and ELL, your English language learner categorical grant. And so that leaves you a much smaller amount that you need to raise by using your homestead rate. And as Representative Beck pointed out, it's not all coming from the homestead tax. It is pulling in, it's giving everyone equal access to the resources in the education fund, some of which are from the homestead tax and some are from other taxes. So you take that remaining amount that you want to raise on the homestead rate, you divide by your ADMs. This is actual pupils, they're not weighted. And they're not weighted because we already took care of that cost side in the earlier columns. Okay, so you're back to your regular ADMs and you come up with your homestead rate, just the way it is now. So essentially what's happened is that we've taken the weighting that the UVM study came up with, and we've applied it to the costs side. It is for cost equity. We've sent that amount out to the districts. And then that should lower their, if they're say high poverty, it should lower their cost substantially. The remainder then goes on this yield model that we currently have based on their actual ADMs. And so if you think about where this makes a big difference is, say you have a tuition district and they have, I don't know, say they have 50 kids and they're paying tuition for 50 kids. But if we took away their ADMs basically through this process and we said they had, they only have 48 equalized pupils, they would have to pay, this is using the current law method, they would have to pay the tuition for 50 kids divided by only 48 students and their tax rate would go way up. In this case, that wouldn't happen. The tuition theoretically would be 62% of what it is now because the tuitioning, the district that they tuitioned to got 38% aid to reduce their budget. And then they would, the tuitioning town would then take that tuition amount, which is 62% of what it would have been, and divide by their actual ADMs. They're not losing any ability to do this. But I think that the main point is that it incorporates the cost equity that we're getting from the UVM team without interfering with or conflicting or confusing the tax equity that we're pretty good at achieving in the first place in terms of equal spending. Has an equal spending per pupil gives you an equal tax rate.
Let's pause there for just a second, see if there are questions. Representative Beck, did you have something or?
I don't, thank you, Deb. I was able to follow pretty easily.
One thing I want to note, Deb, just correct me if I'm wrong, so that if you're looking at your columns, column 6, the original FY20 spending, is that the original FY20 education spending?
Yes,
Okay, so that already has the existing categorical aid grants subtracted out of it.
right,
Like special ed and transportation, and if they got a small schools grant back then and all those. So, okay.
right. So Brad and I have been consistently using the same number.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Okay,
I wanted to clarify because I know that sometimes we've mentioned special education, but it's already accounted for in this education spending, the way it worked in FY20. Okay, are there other questions or comments at the moment? Are we following along okay? Okay, go ahead.
all right. So one of the questions that you asked last time was how the rates change and how they're different than the current law method of running it through the equalized pupils. And I guess I should just want to back up a little bit and say, if you didn't do this, if instead you did the equalized pupil version, at the point at which the streams diverge, and we go different ways, the current law equalized pupil version, it's sort of like a sudden case of musical chairs when the equalized pupils are moving all around. It's, to me, it's very confusing, but it's also less fair in that, and we've mentioned this before, but that basically what's happening is that the aid, if you call it, the result is that a poverty student will get more from the ed fund in a high spending district than it would in a low spending district. And it's confusing. I don't think that it's intuitive, and I don't think that it's clear to people what would be happening. As it isn't even clear to us when we work on it. I mean, as you were noticing when you looked through the file this morning, there are ones that you come to that you can't quite explain. But anyway, and I think that the reason for that is really that it is confusing and merging the cost equity portion and the tax equity portion. But so for that reason, I'm sort of reluctant to compare the tax rates, because the tax rates that you get from mushing the two together and not separating them clearly are less, let's see, the people whose tax rates would go up don't go up as much under the, when you mush the two together, and the people whose tax rates would go down don't go down as much when you mush the two together as it would during a direct application of the cost equity. But anyway, Dan, I think it's,
One just second, we have a question. Representative Kornheiser.
Can you explain one more time what you mean when you say when you mush the two together?
yeah. So under current law, when we change the equalized pupils, that's moving it into the tax raising category rather than keeping them separate. So it ends up changing the effect of what you were creating in the cost equity side. And it almost works against itself. In other words, you would give a weight, and then by changing your tax capacity as well, you're almost watering down what you've done through the cost equity side.
That makes sense. Thanks. To me.
It's hard to make sense out of something that isn't, to me, doesn't really make sense.
You have another question, Senator Perchlik?
It's not really a question, but just on that.
Can you get to your mic?
On that point is, that's why the weight went up so much this last round. The ELL up so high because we're doing these complicated formulas. We're not. Yeah, I guess I don't know how to explain it. That last exchange made it more clear. Just another example of why that weight had to go up so much.
Because they're interacting with each other,
Yeah.
the interaction effect, yeah. And in the way that Deb is calculating the costs, they're still interacting with each other. But then the interaction, after the costs are calculated, the interaction stops.
Right.
It's doing it upstream, like what you were suggesting.
Right,
All right, other questions at the moment while we have a pause? Okay, carry on, Deb.
Well, actually, I was thinking as a result of that question that before the weights are determined, we have determined the weights by backing into them by the formula. But once you have that set of weights, I think you can rely on your own wisdom and local experts and actual costs and actual programs and interventions or whatever to adjust them to things that make sense. And I think that it's easier to do that when you're looking at them as something other than a 0.36. So this is just, I'm just going forward with these comparisons, assuming that these are the correct weights. Okay. So let's see, I think at the bottom, so this would be page 3. There's a comparison district by district of the weights. And there's sort of 2 sets off to the right. Columns 6 and 7 are comparing the rates when you have the ELL grant or the ELL weight at 2.49. And the one column is CE, cost equity, and the other column is the weighted equalized pupils. And I put in the column 4, which is just showing you for cost equity, the cost equity formula, after you had subtracted the cost equity payment from the spending, and then you divided by the ADMs, it would give you your new spending per ADM. And the average is 10,300, let's see, 436. And so you can pretty much see that the districts that spend more than that will have a higher rate under the cost equity formula than under the weighted equalized pupil formula. And the ones that spend less than that will have a lower rate with the cost equity formula than with the equalized pupil formula. And the reason is,
Yeah, exactly. Could you explain that again? Both Representative James and I got a little confused there.
okay. Let's see. If you look at column 4, okay, we're redefining high spenders here. All right. So now the average remaining spending after we've subtracted the cost equity, we've dealt with cost equity, we've dealt with giving you the extra amount that you need to deal with the particular characteristics of your pupils. Okay, then we take the remainder and divide by your ADMs, and that's sort of giving you that base student amount. And if the average is 10,436, the average by district. And so if you want to understand, sort of want an overview of why the rates are different between the cost equity column 6 and the current way we would do it, the equalized pupil column 7, it's basically because of the difference in the remaining education spending per ADM, the difference in column 4. That's the most significant difference. And if you're spending more than the 10,436, you would expect your weight under the cost equity to be higher than your rate under the equalized pupil. In other words, column 6 should be higher than column 7.
Okay,
Deb,
go ahead, Representative Kornheiser.
so that 10,436, if I wrote down the number you said, right, isn't, it's not a policy decision number or a number that we're officially declaring. It's almost a default number that results from what's sort of left out of
Right.
individual districts' choices. Is that correct? And so it's almost
That's
like
right.
all the education budget voters in the whole state have somehow accidentally come to consensus that this is what the average spending, unweighted spending per pupil should be.
No, it's not what should be, it's what happens.
What happens?
In
Well,
other
and-
words, it is just plain the average of,
Yeah.
it is the average, given that we've already sent them 36% of education spending. This is the rate that would result when they had to raise the remaining.
And I think that back to one of the things you were saying at the beginning, when we were looking at your chart, one of the policy questions is that the right ratio? Is the
Yeah.
6% going to all the weights versus 64% going to the base amount, the right ratio? Or is there, is there a better amount that we want to spend on as a base amount? Do we want the base amount to be higher or lower and having more going toward the cost equity payments? So just breaking it into cost becomes, you can sort of see how it sort of separates out the way that we spend money. Yeah, go ahead,
And
Representative.
so
Kwanzaa.
then if a district decided that they want to spend more than that on their base student, what would then their tax rate, what would then happen to their tax? How would that then move through the system and what would happen to their tax rate?
So it's the same thing that happens now. It is, if their spending goes up, you divide by the yield and your rate is higher. I should point out also that in a sense, this is functioning as its own excess spending threshold, but it's not a threshold. But because there is less that we're raising on the yield, every additional dollar amount makes is a greater increase in your tax rate than it is currently. But this is the local control side, basically, that you can spend what you want. We're going to send you, we're going to take care of the cost equity. We're going to send you this payment based on the categories that we've already talked about. And then after that, the remainder is up to you. And what you spend per pupil is sort of, it's per base pupil. We've taken care of your extra needs. Then it's up to you. And the more you spend per pupil, the higher your tax rate will be. But if you and the next district spend the same amount per pupil, you'll have the same tax rate.
How's everyone doing? Okay. Carry on, Deb.
Okay. So I told you that the under cost equity, you would have a, let's say a lower, if you're have a lower spending per pupil, you would have a lower tax rate. And then you would under the equalized pupil version. And the reason for that is that under cost equity, that you would get this average amount, the amount that we have in the table for every poverty student. It would be the same in a high spending district and a low spending district. In the current model, by changing equalized pupils, for a poverty student, you would get less in a low spending district and more in a high spending district. So in a low spending district, you're better off going with cost equity because you get that full amount for every poverty student. So for high poverty towns, low spending towns, they will end up with low spending per equalized pupil. So they're much better off getting that average amount. And therefore their tax rate would be lower under the cost equity approach and higher, higher under the current law or the equalized pupil approach.
Any questions so far? Okay. Keep
And-
going.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's Rep. James.
And sorry, one more time, and high spending districts with low poverty, are they?
Okay, high spending districts will get under cost equity for each poverty student, they will only get the average amount. Okay, on the table, the cost table that we looked at under cost equity. If we run it through the equalized pupils, the amount that they get from the ed fund for each poverty student is equal to that spending, their spending per pupil. So they will get more than the average amount. Okay, so therefore the tax rate, their tax rate would end up being lower under the current equalized pupil model than it would be under cost equity.
Representative Beck?
Thanks, Deb. Maybe I can put this in a different context because it's kind of hard to get your head around, but what causes the problem that Deb is speaking of here is the fact that under our current system, a district's homestead tax rate is a byproduct of all of its education spending, when
Yeah.
only part of that is supported by the homestead taxes. What Deb's done here is by supporting those categorical grants with non-homestead spending, is she's taken away a significant portion of that disconnect. And that's what makes it more of a level playing field than the current system.
There are other questions? Representative Conlon, did you have? No? Okay. Go ahead, Deb.
So that's basically what I had prepared for you. I've got the same chart. I guess it's not up online, but you can look at it if you want, the same chart for going to the ELL weight.
Yeah, they're all together that in one document. So if you just keep scrolling, you can see the different ones.
Oh, okay, I didn't get that far. Great, thank you.
Sure. I think it's page 5 and 6 I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. Thank you. But I didn't want to take you through that, but you can look at it if you want to see the difference. But it's basically the concept that I wanted to go through, because I feel it's somewhat, it's a choice that's somewhat independent of the weights. Just figuring out how you want to apply them.
All right. So if there are not questions, maybe we can spend, let's see, what time is it? It's 11:20. We have at 11:30. So we have about 10 minutes for a little discussion, sort of reaction. What are people thinking? What information do they need, et cetera. Representative Conlon.
I think it was, you brought up a point that I hadn't really thought about is, these are numbers that are calculated based on current spending, but we don't know if they're the right number. And I'm curious to know his thoughts on how we get to that point,
To the,
how we, how we resolve that conflict.
right, so there are a couple options. One of the things that the research team said that they could do if we spent a little bit more money and gave them a little bit more time is to come up with the cost equity or the cost equivalent payment for each of the weights. Deb is backing into it, so to give us an idea of what it might be, but they could run it through their regression and do it based on their data. And so we could ask them to do that. It would be a contract with them that we would, and then some of the $25,000 that was allocated to us, we could use for that purpose. So we could get those numbers. It would be based on the weights. And I think another question is, that rate, the overall ratio of the 38% or the 36% for the total package of the weights versus the 64% or 62% or whatever of the base spending per pupil. So that's a sort of policy decision or policy discussion we should have too, but we can contract with them. We could also go with another researchers to have them do it a different methodology to tell us what those costs are, because there are different methodologies to coming up with it. That would probably take more time. Representative, yeah,
When we get to that 62-38 split, that's based on the numbers that Deb backed into. So that split would change depending on whatever new numbers, quote, the right numbers.
it is based on the numbers that Deb backed into, but the numbers that Deb backed into are based on the weights. And so if we were asking the researchers to come up with a number, they would be using their methodology, which is what came up with the weights. So it would probably, we all have been surprised before, but it would probably be around the same kind of ratio. It would maybe a little bit different, but.
So, and there's two different policy, there's sort of a mathematical policy choice sort of built into those two different scenarios. So in the study, they have cost equivalents that came out of I've just been describing as the statistical machine lately, because that's what's working for me. Then the cost value sort of came out, and then they turned those into weights, right? Like that was statistics, like the really high level modeling statistics created cost value coefficients, and then more math was applied to make the weights. And so they can give us what initial cost value coefficients are. And then we would then have to think about inflators and things like that as we moved forward. On the way Deb backed into it, the 60-30 or whatever the ratio is like a self-contained system that we have, because we always say that sort of these percentages the weights basically create percentages based on the amount that we're spending that then continues to shift over time. So it becomes a more self-contained educational spending system. And as Deb said, there is almost an excess spending threshold built into it. Whereas if we just run with the cost value equivalents rather than backing into it to create a percentage, we would have to build an inflator, which might lead to sort of ongoing increased costs that might or might not be actually tracking with people's spending decisions in the same way.
Well, we wouldn't necessarily have to build in an inflator. We could also ask them to recalibrate it every single
Yes.
year.
Yeah.
Which
Also an option.
would be challenging. But there, and I don't know, Deb, if you want to add to what Representative Kornheiser said about the sort of self-regulating possibility of not having to recalculate it.
Not really, it gets complicated,
Okay.
but I think that we could do it. We could do it by running it through we can do it the same way that we backed into it. By basically every year we would go through and redo Brad's sheet. We'd figure out all of the students in each of the different categories. And then figure out what percentage that is of the latest education spending. And that would enable us to update the weights pretty much automatically based on the change in education spending. So that would be the inflator, basically, would be education spending per pupil.
Mhm.
Or we
And-
could use other kinds of inflators like the state and local government inflator.
Right. And the other consideration is that how we might want to or not want to change those proportions and those amounts based on how much it is quote unquote the right amount to spend, because
Yeah.
this is how much we actually spend, and figuring out the cost equivalents by amounts we actually spend, but they're not necessarily the right amounts, quote unquote. Like, is it really that much? Should we really be spending that much more on these types of categories or not? Should it be more or should it be less? So that's the other complicated factor, but I guess the short answer to your question is the easiest thing to do would be to ask the researchers to come up with some numbers and then go from there, see what they are and see if they make sense to us and go from there.
Yeah, I think the challenge with back into current reality is that we certainly have heard plenty of testimony from districts saying, well, we have not been able to spend what we think we need to spend on these kids because we don't feel like we can afford it.
Mhm. Representative James, did you have something? You had your hand up, I
I
think.
did.
Okay.
I guess just curious about if we're not basing the cost factors on current spending, what do you then how do you even calculate what is the right number then? Where do you even get that data?
Yeah, I think that a lot of that is a different kind of research there was a study previously that did sort of look at that in 2017. Yeah. And sort of what is an adequate amount to spend to get the outcomes you want?
So
And
it's just an entirely different methodology.
it's a
That's what
different
we were talking
approach.
about,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. But also Deb was mentioning last time, Deb and I had this whole conversation about ground truthing it or cost, school truthing it, saying like, what are we seeing on the ground as to what schools really need to spend on different categories of students, and also the base student. And I think that we have to remember that that's quote unquote a category of students, like is 10,336 or whatever it is sufficient or not for the sort of base level that we would be sending out to districts. So Representative Kornheiser.
I mean, I think the thing to remember is that under the weighting scenario, that's also completely, that's based on existing spending too. And in both scenarios, the whole thing with local control is if the $10,000 or whatever it is isn't enough, then districts get to make that decision and spend more and then still be, their tax rates change, but they're still supported by the whole ed fund. So I think the issues that we're bringing up are really important issues, and they're issues that some of them exist in both models. They're not, and they're tension in both models.
Senator Brock.
To ask the existing group to do the modeling that we're talking about, have they given you a time frame?
They can do it pretty quick.
What I guess that I'm hearing sort of in summary is that we may well come up with a model based on what we're spending now that equitably distributes the wrong amount of money.
Possibly.
Okay. Just want to make sure that I was on the same page.
All right, well, I think we need to mull this, have it thinking, spinning in the back of your brain while we move on to the next portion, unless Jane, Brad, you're also on this section. Did you want to add anything here? Okay. And we're going to ask Catherine Benham to come up and take us through some transition mechanisms, and these would differ but depending on what we end up doing.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So last time we met, was that last week that we were all here?
Yeah.
Okay, so last week we sort of talked through these aloud at the end of our meeting, and Representative Conlon, you very appropriately said, maybe we could have these written down. And so now we have them written down, and Catherine so kindly offered to talk with them.
Good, I guess, good midday, good late morning. I'm Catherine Benham from the Joint Fiscal Office. And we're talking through transition topics. Is it called transition on your webpage?
It is. I think it's right up there called transition mechanisms.
So it's a 2-page document, and the first part is just what's in the task force language. So the transition, recommend how transition to the recommended weights and categorical aid to promote equity, blah, blah, blah. There's the homestead tax rate mitigation, which is talked about. The excess spending threshold is talked about. The hold harmless provision is actually not explicitly talked about in your task force language, but it's an additional thing for you all to think about when you're thinking about the transition. So I think the first big question is the transition period. I'm looking at number 1 now. So how big are the transitions that you're asking of these districts? And I think if they're bigger, you might want to transition longer. If they're smaller, you might want to transition shorter. The Act 46 measures had a 4 to 5 year transition. The Act 173 special education funding changes had 4 to 5 years. When we did Act 60, the decreased towns that were having decreased tax rates just decreased. The increasing had a 3-year transition. So I think you all have to decide, look at what the implications are of your proposal, and then decide on the length. 2, going on to the homestead tax rate mitigation. So you have 2 categories of districts. You've got ones with increasing rates and you have ones with decreasing rates, and you can phase them both in, or you might be able to phase in one faster than the other. And one example that would work under either of your formulas is just phasing in the rates. So if you know somebody's rate is going to increase, I don't know, 15 cents, you say no more than 5 cents a year, or some percent, you just do it that way. Obviously, you're going to have to deal with people's spending is going to change also as budgets move forward, but you could navigate that in some kind of way. For the weighting proposal, you could do a rolling average. So you spread the equalized people count over a longer period of time, and so that helps phase them in and out. On the cost equity, you could phase in the cost equity formula in a similar kind of way. So you can, increase it or decrease it over time to give people a chance to adjust. And all of those so far, I've been assuming sort of you've got the standard spending, which all your spreadsheets talk about. And so you have the same sort of property taxes being raised by the same being raised. This third option, if you remember, the education fund actually has some one-time available funds on the bottom of it. And so you could use those also in a way to reduce tax, help the transition. You could direct them specifically you could do it to everybody. You could direct it specifically to the ones that are having an increased rate, and then let the decreased rates drop faster. And the nice thing, then when I think about this is one-time money, and this transition is a one-time event. I mean, you could spread it out over a few years, but it's not, the current surplus on the bottom of the ed fund is not really, it's not available ongoing expected. So I like the tie out between using the money that way.
Hold on
And
just one second.
And if we don't am I right in that if we don't decide to do this, whether or not we decide to do, we could decide to do this in a specific way and direct it in a specific way, but if we don't, it will lower, that surplus sitting there will lower everyone's rates regardless, like if we don't.
Yes, as the legislature, so at the end of
Yes.
the, if you don't decide, if the legislature decides collectively, yes, to not to use it, yes, it could go to all property. That's right. So you could direct it to all property tax rates. You could direct it to a portion. You can, and this does not, the 66.7 does not include, there's also the is it 14 million for the set aside for teachers pension? That is also, that's a different pot of money, but you can, yes, you will have an interesting discussion deciding how to use these funds. And the one concern is when you use one-time funds to lower tax rates, then the next year they're going to go bump up. So how do you set up the expectations and use it in a way that?
And I think I'm asking because before we are able to act, the tax letter is going to come out, which will essentially do this. It will use that money to lower everyone's tax rates. And so, which is nerve wracking because it is something close to one-time money. And then there's sort of the next year after that. And so directing it makes sense even from that sort of other perspective.
Representative James.
Thank you. This is just a really small technical question, but when you decide how to allocate that 67 million, does it sit in the ed fund earmarked, or do you actually say, okay, we're going to use this to mitigate impacts over 5 years, and we're going to move that money out and put it in this account over here? Just a very small question. I was just curious about where the money lives.
I think you would leave it in the ed fund, but you could, just like you've marked the money for the teacher discussion, you could just you put it aside and have a line item there. So the 66 point, I didn't pull up the ed fund, but it has unreserved, unallocated on that line item on the bottom line, and above that is the 14 million. So you could clearly earmark it in that way.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody has any strategy of any sort of.
And you can roll it in too. You could use part of it each year, not use it all in one year.
I guess that's what was
Yeah.
making me nervous. That you can still clearly say, we need this for the next 5 years and keep it there. And we will come back next year.
I can't speak for
We can
future
always
years.
change it. We can always change it.
You can always change it. But when you've earmarked it, I mean, you've clearly made a statement. And so if you
Right.
change it, then that would be a clear statement. I'm trying to think about the 27th pay period in the budget. We put aside money for the 27th pay period. It doesn't happen that often, but we allocate a little bit every year. So you have a history of, if you have an appropriate purpose and a compelling argument, I think future legislatures are likely to abide by it unless there's some extenuating
Upheaval.
circumstance.
Okay.
Right.
Other perks like
And this 66 million is an estimate, it's like the consensus estimate.
Right. This is a
for
July
the rest
one.
of
Yeah.
fiscal year, right?
That's right.
And is the conventional wisdom of why we have this or why we're projecting this is because of the increase in consumption taxes that go to the education plus other federal money that's helping to meet some of.
Yeah, I think this is just the sales tax. This is not about the other federal, I don't think we've had any estimates on those. Those other federal monies flow to schools in other ways, but not through here unless am I
No,
right? Yeah.
it's,
This is
Yeah.
just increase.
This is just increase, yes. And, things look bright generally in the revenue revenues that are coming in, but this is based on the revenue. This was a July 1 revenue based on the July revenue
So
forecast.
so we're
No,
just
we-
going to send it to everyone. Right.
So even though we call it a one-time money, it may or may not be.
I just forwarded it.
Well, it may or may not be, that's true, but the forecast is, you assume the forecast sort of has the ongoing, so, right. I think in January, there'll be a new revenue forecast. And like anything, you never hit it right on the nose here, it's a forecast and you see where you end up, yes. But you will, that's right, I do want to say you will have a new revenue forecast as the legislature to revisit and think about it when you're deliberating.
Okay, carry on.
So those are sort of those, and we talked through different ways to do taxes, talking about excess spending. So and now I may turn to Jim if we need to, or Brad, but the excess spending, you may need to, depending on how you end up with your pupil counts and spending per pupil, you may need to recalibrate what the number is and how you want to draw it. And I guess the real question is also, do you keep it during the transition, or do you increase it so that you're only capturing, I mean, I understand there's the philosophical viewpoint that it contains spending, so maybe you want to put it at a higher level to have something there for political, for reasons. I don't know if you want to continue to capture all the districts that are close to it right now, given all the changes that are going on. You could just suspend it for the transition and then you calculate it to come in at the end of assuming you do 5 years, the 5-year transition. But it's an important thing to think about as you do it. And schools will be will be a very different realm for them if either of these proposals go through. So figuring out how to navigate that and will be interesting for all of them.
Representative Beck?
I would add, based on what Deb Brighton presented, if we were to pursue that type of arrangement, that the excess spending threshold probably is necessary for the lower yield like that.
Kornheiser?
I think it's really important that we've talked a lot about suspending for the course of transition. I think if we do that, it's really important that we're very clear what it will be at the other end of the transition. So we're not surprising people, and that it doesn't then, and that we put it in law that it's going to start on that date, not that we say on that date, we're then going to decide about the excess spending threshold. I think we all know how that would play itself out. And I think the idea of increasing it is an interesting one, and just setting that in law at the increased threshold that just sort of sits there through the transition. But something high enough that we would be holding harmless the folks who are operating right now for them to find their way.
That's a good point. I think on all of this is a good point about being clear about how you're going to end the transition. And you can either choose to set things now, so you're signaling to everybody, or you could choose to redefine, which ends up a very different conversation. And then the other provision is the 3.5% harmless provision, where you don't lose more than 3.5% of your student count. I'll just point out that we had, for this 1 year for COVID, we had the provision where nobody lost, the student counts were held. ADM pupil count was held at FY 2020 for 1 year. That was 1 year provision, but that was in place. So I think for depending on your transition provisions and how long you go, you might, depending on what else you're doing in your transitions, you might or might not want to keep this 3.5%. It's because it's one more piece on top of it, and you might see how people are affected first before you get into that. But it's a complicating piece that will matter to people who are losing students, obviously, but there may be other provisions that are helping them. So that's a piece of, it's one more final piece in the puzzle that you would want to look at in this.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. Are there questions for Catherine at the moment? Representative Conlon?
Back just on that one last piece around the hold harmless provision, that's based on equalized pupils. So if we went to a system that didn't even have equalized pupils, we would
That's
really
true.
have to take a look at that and sort of
You're right.
rejigger it or eliminate it completely.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, this transition conversation is one of those things that we have to figure out, and it, depending on what model we go with or models, it would be different. Did you want to add something?
Well, I just
Sorry.
want to say some of it would be different, but some of it might pick the same time. I don't know if you're going to land on one proposal or the other, or I don't know what the task force will end up, but you could just say, yes, we think you need to do 5 years, and you need to, you're going to move everybody at the same transition, both the people who are decreasing, people who are increasing, or you want to help some people faster than others. I think.
Right. Go ahead, Representative Cornhusker.
One thing I keep on circling about is the idea that so 5 years was just sort of a number that felt extended enough, has been used other times. I think there's legislation that's floated around for 3 years, but all of those feel arbitrary to me because I still haven't seen how much sort of the maximum tax rate change under this model would change per year if we stretched it out over 5 years. And so for me, the more important question is like, what is an acceptable tax rate change for a district to sit with in a single year that doesn't cause an undue burden in any direction? Too much money all at once is actually also very confusing and overwhelming, or too much tax capacity is confusing and overwhelming. And so for me, I feel like I need to get closer to that number about what's the acceptable change threshold in a single year for a district before I can figure out how many years we're stretching something out over, even if I want to sort of aim for 5 years. And then there's the fact that we're not looking at real tax rates yet. We're looking at model tax rates based on 2020 and all of those other things. So I think I want to move closer to what that acceptable tax rate change is as we're sort of picking a mechanism. And I have no idea of what that number is.
Senator, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Senator Hooker.
I was just going to ask, how do you determine that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Scott has it.
Just make sure you have your mic. I'm sorry. I
Sorry.
know people out there trying to hear everybody.
How would that be determined?
Right. What the acceptable
Yeah.
increase is,
What the
yeah.
acceptable rate is?
Representative
Thanks.
James.
That was my question.
Nobody has an answer.
I don't know if this is the answer, but I've been through this a few times before on a few different subjects. And one thing that was presented that I thought always made sense to me is if you look at the delta of the people that would be most impacted, and you divide that out by the an expected interest or inflation rate, and then you'd say, well, if you guys held your spending flat, inflation would take care of you over this many years. If that makes any sense. And that was kind of I thought a reasonable start point for to start the conversation. Doesn't mean it's the answer, but it was just an approach that was looked at.
Mhm. That's an interesting concept. Senator Perchlik?
The only idea that came into my head was that you look at what any one district or maybe an average that they have voted on themselves. Like sometimes they vote an increase, like what percentage has been bearable enough to vote yes for when they voted on a budget they know is going to increase by X percentage. You could look at that number throughout the state throughout time.
Yeah, we could do a statewide average, what people, it would be hard to do an individual district and have every.
Yeah, no,
district being
statewide,
different.
say like
Yeah.
at what point do people stop voting for budgets?
Mhm. Senator Brock.
It's just a comment on the inflation issue. Inflation right now is much more unknown than it's been in the past, and it'd be very hesitant to base a whole lot on projecting inflation when we're seeing some extreme spikes even right now.
Average inflation.
Well, that's average in the past.
Average expected, yeah.
Yeah, it is true that we're in a different world right now that might be hard to calculate. Representative Conlon?
I was going to say, it's going to be hard not for whatever we come up with not to seem arbitrary anyway. The inflation number is challenging because that's not the only factor. The other factor is enrollment.
Mhm.
In AEM.
Right, with districts with declining enrollment, that has a huge impact. Yeah, absolutely. Representative Kornheiser?
I was just gonna add that, there's a sort of a specific inflator that's more tied to education spending that might be more effective than sort of general inflation that takes into account, the cost of milk.
And I also think it's important that we remember for the districts that are going up and the districts that are going down. If, for example, if you in under 60, it seems like they let the decrease happen immediately. But once a decrease happens, and decide different things the next year, you're back into the increase. And so, you will be in the same spot and you'll get a 1-year benefit, and then you'll have to be going back to your voters and saying, actually, we want to increase things. So thinking about how things go up and down gradually, I think is as important, so that districts don't get a shock in either direction.
The Act 60, since they want the ones that drop faster than the ones who went up, that required a subsidy then.
Yes, and they raised it was a sales tax, right? That went up. I'm looking at Brad, yeah. It was a lot of money. There was a lot of money. I mean, there was a substantial influx of money so that there were a lot of people benefited from the influx of money. So it helped out a lot of other people also as well. And so there were some extreme. There was, a 5% tax rate. I mean, it's pretty extreme at that time. I do want to say that this makes me remember about Act 60. Transitioning is hard also. It didn't just go straight from the foundation formula. There was a 1-year transition because you're in the year and you're trying to work through things and you can't change everything at once. So there was actually a different sort of funding formula in that 1-year transition. Then it went into what we all know is the current Act 60 funding. So I had forgotten about that until we were talking about it, but it was when you actually get down to trying to work through it, there's this timing lag that makes it hard to transition well. So it was a whole, do you remember? You probably don't. It's like a thermostat, I think we called it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of averaging going on, says Brad. Brad is not mic'd. So if we're going to rely on him, we need to get him up to the mic. I think that's especially important if we were to transition to the cost equity formula, because it's not a completely, but it's a very different way of doing things right now than we do right now. And that may require some kind of hybrid in between kind of thing as we transition to that new system, in addition to the tax rate mitigations up and down. One thing, so we have about 8 minutes before we're going to take lunch. Are there other questions or comments for Catherine? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks.
One thing I think it's important, this is our third to last meeting, so we are running out of time quickly as to what we need to do. We have in the background started drafting various pieces of the report. Some of you have sent in things. Thank you for doing that. And we're creating drafts as we go with some of the things that we've already decided. Obviously, the big question is yet to be decided. And we are running short on time. So we do need to start making some decisions about what we're going to do. And one option is to make a clear recommendation of this is what we think is the best thing. We should go with X. And this is why, these are the reasons why we should go with X. Another option, and then we draft that bill and introduce it. And that is, I think, what certainly I thought we were going to do and should do, because it seems to me that's what we were charged with doing. However, the other option is that we go with, hey, there's this option and these are the pros and cons of this option. And there's this option and these are the pros and cons of that option, and not have a definitive recommendation and a definitive bill. So I'm wanting to ask what your comfort level is with either of those. Representative James.
I prefer the latter.
The latter being the options, the
Yeah.
pros and cons.
Yep, I think that we've had some really great conversations. I don't know if I'm the only one on the task force that doesn't feel definitive, but I would rather see us present our work and all of the great work we've done to our colleagues as we took a hard look at this, we took a hard look at that. They both have things to recommend, to recommend them, write up the pros and cons, and bring that to the legislature. That's just me. That's my preference.
Senator Perchlik.
That would be my preference if we knew we're divided, but if we all agreed, then I don't think we would do it that way. But I would like to hear where we all are, but if if we're a divided of mind of which way to go, then I think that makes sense. I mean, I think the education committees are going to sort of do that anyway. So even if we do have we have the public record, so they can go look through all our work and stuff, but we could explain it more if we want.
They could redo everything we did.
Well, they can. Yeah.
Senator,
That being said, I mean, they would probably do that anyway. Whether it's a bill or a choice. And I would think that by offering what we've learned, it would be a better starting place. So having that comparison.
okay, so I'm hearing at least, it's Representative Beck.
I'm for a definitive recommendation with the pros and cons of that recommendation.
A single definitive recommendation. Okay, Representative Conlon.
Yeah, I would echo that. I worry that if we just sort of say, here's our work, you choose, without a definitive recommendation, they're going to have to go through the exact same process that we did through it and reinvent the wheel.
Senator Brock.
I agree with a definitive recommendation because otherwise you're going to have the committees have to commit a study.
And create another task
Exactly.
force. All right, Rep. Kornheiser.
I'll just say straight out that I vastly prefer the cost equity model for policy reasons. I think it, as Deb said, it sort of divides out the issue of, spending equity from tax equity and solves both problems in a way that when they're the same conversation, they're not both solved. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to fully model it that we don't have in front of us and we're not going to be able to fully have in front of us. So I don't think if that's what we recommend, it still wouldn't be a bill, I don't think, given the amount of, there's still sort of a lot open about the impacts of actually either model. There's still like, we haven't modeled what this means on the income yield and what happens when we put the CLA into account and like all of, just things that the Ways and Means Committee would do, not the Education Committee, that are like really necessary to look at what a transition plan would look like and how it would impact it. I feel very aware that we still, while we sort of have this tax rate put in there, we don't actually know how that will impact revenues, given all of the different ways we have of relieving people's and shifting people's tax burden. And so, yeah, that's the end of my sentence.
So I think what I'm hearing is that two people are leaning toward wanting to have the two big options and with all the details on the sides of those. 4 people are leaning toward wanting to go in one direction. And I think I heard you saying you wanted
I
the
think I'm
2
like
options.
halfway between
Yeah.
the 2 options.
Yeah.
I'm like in
That's
between the 2.
frankly, that's where I am
I'm
too.
on
I'm
1.5.
like, I see the pros and cons of doing either. And I was really, really optimistic that we could get to a recommendation. And I feel like that's what we were asked to do. We were asked to come up with a recommendation so that we can hit the ground running in what is going to be a very, very busy session. And if our education committees and our money committees have to go through all of this again, it's going to be really hard to do that. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we're at a definitive recommendation. So those of you who would like a definitive recommendation, do you feel like you're at a definitive point? I'm going to go with Representative Beck because I'm pretty sure I know where you're at.
I think clearly after all the testimony we've heard and all the equity issues that would be solved by, we should go to a cost equity model.
Okay, what about you, Representative Conlon?
It's really hard. Policy reasons are, I think, strongly supportive of the cost equity method, getting out of equalized pupils, sticking with ADM. There's just so many good reasons for it. It's going to be the transition that's going to be the hard part and how we deal with the districts. And as we all saw, because of the first lines of this thing, Addison County, where we live, is, it's going to be a very challenging transition.
Yeah. Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, I would echo what was just said, and I would support the cost equity formula or method. And then we would say, here's the additional work that needs to be done, not only on the transition, but on the question of like, are these the right numbers? And what are the other things? What are the known unknowns? You know, do a Donald Rumsfeld kind of explanation on
Oh, please, no.
Rough choice.
No.
the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. Let's do it all.
Okay, Senator Brock.
I wonder, and the cost equity is appealing, but I wonder, and I'm concerned of whether or not we have enough information, enough numbers, enough to enable us to really know what the end result is of what we propose doing.
Mhm.
We're rushing to complete this because we've been allotted the amount of time to do it. Are we going to be able to complete it?
So that is a really good question. I think that one of the things Representative Kornheiser and I are sending notes back and forth to each other about is about getting the data behind the numbers behind, or one set of numbers that the researchers who did the weighting study could get us, and about for the cost equity formula. And I still think there might be questions about whether those are the right numbers, because it's one methodology of doing it, but it's based on the methodology of the research that started this thing. So we might as well go there first. And then depending on how long that takes, then we can have Brad and Deb run those numbers and we could see where it ends up.
Well,
Whether that is enough to satisfy, I don't know.
Well, whether or not we are producing a report that's credible because it has the necessary information in it to make our recommendation meaningful. That's just a question in the background of my mind. And you sort of then say, well, what are the alternatives if you need more than the 2 meetings that we've got? Do you toss this to the education committee? Do you extend this to the next year? You say to yourself, is it better to produce a product that you're not sure of on time than to delay? And what's the impact of that? If that's, and I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying that is another alternative.
Representative Kornheiser.
I just want to speak on behalf of the House right now, that the senators keep on talking about this, be going to the Education Committee. And the education taxes tend to spend more time in the Ways and Means Committee on the House side. I know they spend more time in the Education Committee on the Senate. So just want to speak on behalf of the Ways and Means Committee and our purview, that we would probably spend some time on this. I hear you saying, Senator Brock, is sort of what Senator Perchlik was saying, that like we're going to have to name the known unknowns and the unknown, whatever that was.
Words.
But I think in some ways, you know, this is a process that I went into with a lot of very clear ideas, and I've found myself towards some really deep curiosity about what equity means through this process. And I think there's actually a lot of credibility to naming the questions that remain. And that's something that we don't do as often as we could as leaders.
So, Representative James.
No, you thought we were done, but
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
yeah, I just want to, I want to elaborate on why I would love to see a report that includes options. And it feels a little bit off of what Emily just said. The journey that we've done has actually been, we've come a long way. And if you had told me in June that I would wind up being very intrigued by all of the equity options and maybe the equity advances that are to be made by a cost equity model, I would have said, no way. Like, what do you, We're going to update the weights, and that's what we're doing because that's what we need to do. And I think when I think about an action plan or a report that really lays out in clear terms the pros and the cons of a weighted model using the October 28th and the cost equity model, even if one is an appendix or something. I think that honors the work we've done, and I think it honors where our colleagues might be starting from in a more clear way. Because if we deliver an action plan that, says, hey, we've done all this work and we've come up with this cost equity model, and we're going to definitively recommend this, I think the very first question that most of our colleagues are going to say is, what about the weights? And they're going to go back there anyway. And they're going to redo all that work anyway, because we didn't lay it out. So I hope that was more clear about where I'm coming from.
Go ahead. You want, well, so what I was going to say was, I think regardless of which option we go with, whether we have a definitive thing or options, oh my gosh, we will, I think, need to lay out our argument. And so if we're recommending one and not the other, we would have to lay an argument for why not recommending the other. If we're recommending both or as options, we'd have to lay out the arguments for why we're recommending them both as potential options. So I want, the report is not, it doesn't exist right now, but I have, it's sort of like jumped up in a bunch of people's minds as like, these are the expectations for the report. And, but right now I want to make sure we are able to eat lunch unless, okay. So let's make sure we have some lunch. It is a little after, it's 12:06. Let's get back here by 1, so that we can continue this